This podcast is the sequel of the broadcast Ancient Aliens in the Old Testament, also on this channel. The current chapter focuses on the question of a contemporary conception of God. Is it possible that a religion could be based on scientific knowledge? That it could begin where scientific knowledge is limited by human finitude and grow beyond it? The so-called proofs of God play a central role in this. The ancient Greek philosophers already dealt with them. As early as the 6th century BC, Anaximander asked about the beginning, the primordial substance, the primordial ground. He called it a pyrrhon, something boundless and indeterminate. This made him the first Greek philosopher who did not assume that the cause of the world was a personalized God. In Aristotle, we find the idea of the unmoved mover. This is not to be understood as the personified creator God as known to Christians. It is rather a spiritual, divine, primal ground that consists of eternal self-thinking thought. It is unmoved because, as the original mover of the world, it stands above the movement of the world. It itself has no beginning and no end. The Greek philosophers explained the idea of the first mover of the world to their students by taking a stick and moving a stone with it. The hand moves the stick moves the stone moves a grain of sand, and so on. The leading intellectual figure of the Middle Ages who devoted himself to proving the existence of God was the scholastic Thomas Aquinas. For him, theology was based on philosophy. His 5 proofs of God's existence are still valid today. The proof of motion is based on the observation that there is motion everywhere in the world. However, motion only arises if there is also a mover. But because the series of movers cannot go back infinitely, without there having been a beginning of motion at some point, there must be a first mover. For nothing can be the cause of its own effect at the same time. This mover, itself unmoved, would then be God. The proof of causality assumes that every effect has a cause. However, nothing can be the cause of itself, because then it would have to precede itself. Nor can the series of causes go on indefinitely. Consequently, there must be a first self-caused cause, namely God. The proof of contingency is based on the fact that there are things that are necessary, either in themselves or through another thing. Whereas in immanence there is nothing that can create itself, but owes its existence to another being. Furthermore, the immanent is dispensable, that is, it does not exist necessarily, but rather accidentally or contingently, in contrast to the necessary. But here too, the series of necessary things cannot go on indefinitely. There must be a first necessary, namely God. The proof of degree assumes that good exists everywhere in the world in varying degrees of perfection. If one excludes recourse to an infinite series of immanent efficient causes, the highest degree of goodness and perfection must be a being that owes its virtues to no one else, but carries these qualities within itself to an infinite degree. That would then be God. In the proof of finality, the entire cosmos is orderly, purposefully constructed, and goal-oriented. Irrational things require someone who recognizes and sets the goal in order to achieve it, for example, the archer's arrow. The goal-oriented structure of the world therefore needs God as a supreme ruler, who sets the goals and thus moves the world. Another great thinker of the Middle Ages, Nicholas of Cusa, formulated a theorem that is considered the key statement of his doctrine of God, the coincidence of opposites in God. God is the absolute greatest that can be and therefore cannot become smaller. The smallest is the absolute smallest that can be. It cannot become smaller, but also cannot become larger, because then it would no longer be the smallest. It is of the same nature as the greatest, with which it therefore coincides. The ontological proof of God's existence by the medieval thinker Anselm of Canterbury essentially states that there is nothing greater that can be conceived. His critics, however, say that God is greater than anything that can be conceived. The modern assessment of proofs of God's existence is largely based on Immanuel Kant's critique of pure reason. It limits possible insights into facts to the realm of sensory perception. The modern thinker René Descartes, with his insight, "I think, therefore I am," and the resulting conclusion that if he exists, someone must have created him, provided another important clue on the path to recognizing the mover of the world. The weak point of his reasoning, however, is that his insight is an individual one, that is, it is not universal. Nevertheless, it should suffice to conclusively infer the existence of the mover of the world. Catholic theologian and philosopher Robert Spemann calls belief in God the immortal rumor. With his argument on the question of God, Spemann follows Nietzsche, who once wrote, "I fear we will not get rid of God because we still believe in grammar." By following structures that claim to have an overarching meaning, such as grammar, we understand the world as being built on meaningful principles. This, in turn, presupposes that we humans can recognize the truth and, in it, the trace of God in the world, whereby for Spemann, man himself is the trace of God in the world. In his opinion, however, this trace of God only exists if humans want it to, and do not see themselves merely as machines for spreading their genes, with reason as an evolutionary adaptation. Spemann assumes, however, that God exists independently of whether humans recognize him. As the ultimate proof of God, he cites a grammatical proof which he believes to be Nietzsche-resistant. The futurum exactum, the future perfect, is for us necessarily conceptually connected with the present. To say about something that it is now is in the same time to say that it will have been in the future. In this sense, every truth is eternal. The fact that on the evening of December 6, 2004, a large number of people gathered together in the Hochschule for Philosophie in Munich for a lecture on rationality and faith in God was not only true on that evening, it is always true. If we are here today, then tomorrow we will have been here. The present always remains actual as the past of the future present. But what sort of actuality is this? A person could say, it is real in the traces that it leaves behind through its causal impact. But these traces become fainter and fainter. And they are only traces insofar as that which left them behind is recalled for what it is. But memories eventually fade, just as the Earth will probably cease to exist at some point in the distant future. However, the past always belongs to a present, whose past it is. If there is no longer a present, then the past disappears with it and the future perfect tense loses its meaning. But then it would no longer be true that on a certain day numerous people gathered at a certain place to listen to a lecture. That would of course be nonsense, because then this event would never have taken place and the reality perceived by the participants would not be real. This contradiction can only be resolved if one assumes that there is an absolute consciousness in which everything happens, which is suspended and in which eternal truth is eternally true. That would then inevitably be God. Modern scientists, such as Helmut Hansen, assume that their theorem includes the possibility of making the existence of God accessible to empirical verification. However, according to current opinion, both Nicholas of Cues himself and generations of theologians and philosophers have carelessly overlooked this possibility of providing modern proof of God's existence. Since Immanuel Kant, it has been accepted that effort to prove the existence of God should preferably be confined to the realm of the knowable world, or what is commonly referred to as God's work or His creation. However, if God and the world are to be in harmony with each other as creator and creation, then the world must necessarily have a very special structure. This inner-worldly structure must be compatible with the extra-worldly attributes traditionally ascribed to God. The classic attributes include those typical universal ones such as omnipotence, omniscience, omnibenevolence, and omnipresence. Hansen says, if God's creation, or in modern terms, the physical universe, is in one way or another the visible expression of these universal laws, and it must by definition exhibit a structure that is equally consistent and coherent with these universal laws. If it were possible to sufficiently specify this almost divine structure of the universe in theory, then, in accordance with scientific thinking, it would be possible to verify whether the real universe we observe empirically reveals such a theoretically and theologically specified structure or not. In this way, it might then be possible to advance to that natural knowledge of God which has always been only a dream that even after almost 2 millennia of intellectual effort has never been realized. Since the universal determinations traditionally attributed to God are of a transcendent nature and, as such, lie outside the empirical world, it seems that we do not have yet any clear and binding insight into whether and to what extent these universal determinations relate to the visible, immanent world. For a science-based religion, in order to cross the boundary between earthly science and faith, one must not expect irrefutable empirical proof, but must be content with clear indications due to one's own finitude. If we accept this and acknowledge our own limitations, it will be easier for us to cross the boundary between science and faith. In doing so, we overcome our finitude and arrive at a faith that does not have its roots in mystical revelation, unlike most other religions. Similar to deism, it is a belief in the mover of the world based on reason. In addition to the question of its existence, there are other questions concerning the nature of the world mover. Does the world mover influence current events, or did it merely give the world a one-time push? That depends on the reverberations of the push. Was it strong enough to set the world in motion forever? If so, our fate would be predetermined and we would have no free will. Did the merchant in distress make a free decision when he threw his goods overboard to prevent his ship from sinking? Apparently not. So it is more likely to assume that the reverberations of the first world mover keep the world in motion to this day. The scientific discipline that probably has the best chance of proving the existence of God is physics. An initial attempt at this is Frank Tipler's omega point theory, which he presents in his book The Physics of Immortality. Tipler claims that the universe is evolving towards an ultimate point, and that life after death, resurrection, and eternal life are realities. Unfortunately, his omega point theory contains a flaw in reasoning because, as he says, it is based on the postulate of eternal life. In doing so, he introduces an aspect of his theory that needs to be proven as a prerequisite for its correctness. Unfortunately, defining something to be proven as a postulate renders this theory unusable. And his complicated calculations and formulas cannot hide the fact that, with his omega point theory, he is basically only presenting eternal life in the form of a computer simulation. In doing so, he reduces humans to something resembling a character in a computer game. Nevertheless, Tipler deserves credit for making the first attempt to use physics to prove the existence of God. Although this attempt failed, it gives hope that future generations of scientists will be more successful. Creationism provides another argument for the existence of God. It describes the origin of the world through divine creation, either from nothing or by shaping already existing matter. The result is the world as we know it today. Arguments in favor of creationism arise not least from the weaknesses of the Big Bang and evolution theories. First of all, there is no proof and no eyewitnesses for either the Big Bang or evolution. Fossil and soil finds are ultimately only circumstantial evidence, which can also be misinterpreted. In addition, chance plays an exceptionally large role in both theories. However, explaining life on Earth by chance is like expecting an encyclopedia to be created from the explosion of a printing press. Even if evolution had all the time in the world, it would not change the fact that, according to probability theory, the chances of life arising by coincidence are practically zero. Another problem is the emergence of new animal species and life forms through natural mutation or natural selection. Positive mutations are so rare that no one has ever observed one. nor does natural selection necessarily lead to the emergence of a new animal species. Consequently, the evidence for both the theory of evolution and Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection is extremely thin. For example, the theory of evolution cannot explain how flowers were pollinated before bees or other insects existed. Only by the wind? Then why do we need bees? And what did bees feed on before there were honey-producing plants? In other words, which came first, the chicken or the egg? Another example, there are animals whose organs are so perfectly adapted to their habitat that it is impossible to imagine how they could have evolved. Female whales, for example, have a teat that is perfectly adapted to the technique of underwater suckling. This enables the whale calf to drink below the water surface without sucking in water. How could such an organ have developed through evolution? Either it was there as it is, or it wasn't. The theory of evolution offers no explanation for this. It cannot explain so many things that there is no alternative to the theory of divine creation. The Big Bang and evolutionary theories are ultimately just theories developed by scientists who mixed a few liquids in a laboratory and observed an effect. Therefore, for supporters of creationism, there is no reason to abandon their position. Incidentally, creationism does not rule out changes that have occurred since the creation of the world. These would be, so to speak, the echo and further development of divine creation. This would also bridge the gap to Thomas Aquina's proof of motion, because the first movement of the mover of the world could find its echo in his creation. Even Kant's strict argument would be satisfied, because this world is what we humans can perceive through our senses. Incidentally, Christian supporters of creationism believe that a literal interpretation of the book of Genesis describes the actual origin of life and the universe. However, this does not explain how this creation was carried out in detail. The biblical story of creation, which is also found in a similar form in the Quran, only becomes understandable when the ancient alien theory is taken into account. In the usual interpretations, scientific facts normally contradict a literal interpretation of the Bible. However, the ancient alien theory is able to resolve this contradiction, especially when one considers that the records in the Bible and other books were made by people for whom genetic engineering and terraforming could only be explained by divine omnipotence. Ultimately, however, these are all questions that can only be satisfactorily answered when God reveals himself to mankind. Since this is not to be expected in the near future, we must be content with what we have, the proofs of God's existence and a misunderstood book.